The snow was driving sideways when I heard a slow, uneven knock on my cabin door. No one came up this far into the high country in winter, unless they were lost or desperate. I stepped to the window, brushing frost from the pane, and saw a thin figure swaying in the wind. His coat was torn, his boots nearly worn through, and his shoulders hunched like every ounce of strength was gone. He raised one pale hand toward the door just as the wind almost took him off his feet. I had a choice to make: open my door to a stranger, or let the storm finish what hunger had already started. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a moment when one choice could change the rest of your life. My name is Cora Maddox, and I've lived in these mountains going on 3 years now, ever since I buried my husband on the ridge behind our cabin. Before that, I was a rancher's daughter from the flatlands east of here. My folks taught me the value of hard work, keeping your word, and lending a hand when a neighbor's in need. We lived simple, mending clothes until they couldn't hold another stitch, putting by enough for winter, never owing a man more than we could pay. Sundays were for church, even if the preacher had to come in by wagon, and our table was open to anyone with honest eyes and a hungry belly. Life changed after my husband passed. Folks in town meant well enough, but pity sits heavy on a woman's shoulders, especially one without children to keep her company. So I chose the solitude of these hills, where the air stays sharp and clean, and the only sounds at night are the wind in the pines and the crackle of the fire. It was a good life, but it meant every chore fell to me: hauling water, splitting wood, tending the mule, keeping the fence mended before the elk found their way through. The nearest settlement was 7 miles down winding trails, and most weeks I saw no one at all. That evening the fire was burning low when I heard that knock. The wind outside was biting the kind that drives fine snow under the doorframe if you don't keep it swept. I knew opening my door could mean trouble. These mountains hide men running from the law, same as they shelter honest travelers. But the sound was faint, almost polite, and something in it kept me from reaching for the rifle first. I set my hand on the latch, feeling the cold bite through the iron, and eased the door open. The young man on my porch swayed as the warm air touched him. Snow clung to his dark hair, his face was drawn and hollow, and his lips were pale as river ice. He lifted his eyes to mine, and what I saw there made the wind seem quieter for a moment, not threat, but a plea. And just then I knew that whatever the night brought it would start with letting him inside. Boone nearly fell forward when the door swung open. I stepped aside and let the warmth of the cabin pull him in, shutting the wind out behind us. His boots left a trail of half-melted snow across the plank floor. I pointed him toward the chair by the hearth, where the fire had burned down to a deep orange glow. The light caught the sharp lines of his face, all bone and shadow, and the cracked skin at the corners of his mouth. "I haven't eaten in 4 days," he said, voice no stronger than the hiss of the fire. "I'll work for a piece of bread, ma'am." His eyes stayed low, not daring to meet mine. I crossed to the stove without another word, ladled stew from the pot, and set the bowl on the table. The smell of venison and onions filled the room, and his shoulders slumped as though the scent alone eased his hunger. He ate in small, careful bites, though I could see the urge to devour every bit at once. Years of raising stock and planting by the seasons had taught me to notice such things. This boy had been brought up to mind his manners, even when his ribs showed through his shirt. When the bowl was empty, I set a plate of bread and butter before him. "You'll stay the night," I said. "Storm's thickening, and you've no business on the trail in that state." His head came up, and the firelight caught the wet on his cheeks. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't be trouble." I didn't answer that the wind rattling the shutters gave all the reply needed. By morning, the snow lay knee-deep against the north side of the cabin. I found him sitting up, boots pulled on as if he meant to leave. "I should go," he said. "You've done more than enough." I set a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table and nodded toward the chair. Not until you've got your strength back. You're no use to anyone's skin and bone. We talked as he ate. He told me his name was Boone Carter, that fever had taken his folks, and he'd been on the move ever since. He knew farming could mend tools, chop wood, tend stock. I told him spring planting was coming and I could use another pair of hands. His face eased at that, like the thought of steady work was a fire of its own. The days that followed found us in a steady rhythm. Boone split and stacked enough firewood to see me through, next winter mended the sagging fence at the corral, and found the knack for coaxing my mule to pull without balking. Evenings we kept to the fire, me with mending in my lap, him carving little animals from scraps of pine. He spoke of the small farm his parents had kept and how he'd always hoped to build something of his own. Weeks turned into months. He built himself a lean-to beside the cabin, but took his meals with me. The boy who had staggered to my door now carried himself like a man's shoulders broad, from work voice, steady eyes clear. I caught myself noticing in quiet moments how the light struck his face when he smiled, or how he moved with an easy strength. It was a strange thing to feel after years alone, and I kept it to myself. One evening, the sun slid low over the ridge, painting the peaks in gold and shadow. Boone stood beside me on the porch, hands braced on the rail. "Cora," he said, my name plain on his tongue for the first time. "I've been thinking on something, and I need to speak it before I lose my nerve." His eyes held mine in a way that stilled the air between us. "I want to stay," he said. "Not just for the season. I want to make a life here with you." My breath caught. I looked toward the valley, knowing how talk travels and thinking of the years between us. "You're young yet. There's time for you to find someone your own age." He shook his head. "I know what I want. These months have been the best of my life. You gave me more than food and shelter. You gave me a place to belong." Before I could answer, the sound of hooves came from the trees. Lantern light flickered between the trunks. 3 riders came into the clearing, Pastor Elijah Williams from the valley, Marcus Fletcher with his stiff-backed seat, and Samuel Reed. They dismounted without a word, the snow crunching under their boots. "Evening, Mrs. Maddox," the pastor said, his voice clipped. "We need a word about your living arrangements." Boone shifted closer. His hand brushing the handle of the axe leaned against the porch rail. Marcus's eyes fixed on him. "Son, you're the problem. Folks have noticed you up here with a widow woman. It's not the kind of talk that does anyone credit. What Boone and I do on my land is no concern of yours," I said. Pastor Williams' tone hardened. "When it reflects on the moral character of the settlement, it becomes our concern. The boy needs to move on, find lodging in town or with a family." Marcus reached into his coat and drew out folded papers. In the lantern light, I saw neat handwriting filling each page. "Someone's been keeping record of your doings," he said. "When the boy comes and goes, you sharing meals, him working without a shirt in your sight." Boone stepped forward, anger bright in his voice. "Who's been spying on us?" Samuel Reed's eyes slid away. "My wife," he said at last. "Helen thought it her duty to note what she saw while gathering herbs." My hands tightened on the porch rail. Every kindness, every moment of ease between us, turned into something unseemly on those pages. The pastor tucked the papers away. 8 months is far beyond charity. If you don't change the arrangement, we'll have to bring this to the territorial authorities. Moral corruption carries consequences neither of you will care to face." They mounted up and rode back into the trees, their lanterns swinging in the dark. Boone and I stood in the snow, the wind whispering through the pines. I knew the matter was far from over. The night after the pastor and the others rode away, the wind carried every sound farther than it should. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see lantern light moving between the trunks again. Boone worked through the days without saying much, though I could see the set of his jaw each time he passed the porch rail where Marcus Fletcher had stood. We spoke little about the visit, but the weight of it sat heavy in the air between us. On the fourth morning, there came a knock at the door. Not the hard, certain kind of men delivering warnings, but a lighter, hesitant rap. When I opened it, Helen Reed stood there. She looked different than the image I had formed in my mind these past weeks. No righteous steel in her expression, no tightness in her mouth. Instead, her face was pale, and her eyes seemed worn, like someone carrying a load too long. "I need to speak with you both," she said. I stepped back to let her in. She sat at the table without waiting to be offered, clasping her hands, as if to keep them from shaking. "I've been watching you for months," she began. At first I thought it was wrong, a young man living with a widow alone in the hills. My husband believed it was my duty to take note of it. Her eyes shifted toward Boone, then back to me. But what I saw, it wasn't what I expected. She spoke of evenings when she'd passed near the cabin, of seeing me bent over the hearth, tending a pot, while Boone mended a harness of nights when he carried water through sleet so I wouldn't have to walk the icy slope. She mentioned the time he fell ill after working in a cold rain, and I sat by him until his fever broke. I wrote down the truth, she said, reaching into her bag. She laid a worn notebook on the table thicker than the folded pages Marcus had shown. Every kindness, every decent thing, I kept it because I needed to remember it was possible. Boone leaned forward. "Why tell us now?" Helen's voice dropped lower. "Because my husband and the others have decided the gossip isn't enough. They're coming back tomorrow with more men. They mean to separate you for good." Her words came faster, as if saying them quickly would lessen their weight. She told us Samuel believed if I could be declared mentally unfit for living with a younger man, I could be sent to the territorial asylum. As for Boone, they planned to have him arrested for taking advantage of a vulnerable widow. I felt the chill of those words in my bones. Stories of women taken to asylums and never heard from again were not uncommon in these parts. Boone's fists were tight against the table. "And what's Marcus Fletcher's stand to gain from this?" I asked. Helen hesitated, then leaned in. "Your late husband filed a mining claim on this land before he died. Marcus found the record last month. There's silver in these hills, and he means to have it. If you're declared unfit, the land gets sold off to cover the cost of your keep. He's already arranged to buy it cheap." The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of the fire. Helen looked between us. "I'll do what I can to delay them, but you need to decide how you'll answer when they come." She rose, leaving the notebook where it lay. At the door, she paused. "I'm sorry for my part in this," she said, then stepped out into the cold. Boone stood at the window long after she was gone, the notebook still on the table. When he finally turned, his voice was hard. "We leave tonight. If we're gone when they come, they can't touch you." I shook my head. "This is my home. My husband's buried here. I won't be driven off like a trespasser." He stared at me, searching for some other path. "Then what? Fight them with an axe and a hunting rifle?" I looked past him to the snow-covered ridge, thinking of what Helen had said about legal standing and rights that couldn't be brushed aside. "There's one thing they can't argue against," I said slowly. "If we were married, they couldn't claim you were taking advantage of me, and they couldn't declare me unfit for making a sound choice. You'd have standing to defend the land." He stepped closer. "Are you asking me to marry you, Cora?" I met his eyes. "I'm asking to save both our lives, though it wouldn't be the only reason." His hand came to rest over mine on the table. "I've loved you for months, not as a boy grateful for shelter, but as a man who's found where he belongs." We agreed to wed before the night was over. The trouble was finding someone to perform the ceremony with so little time. Then Boone remembered Thomas Morrison, a retired preacher living up near Eagle Ridge. If he's willing to ride down, We can have it done before morning." I pulled out my best dress, dark blue with pearl buttons, and Boone washed up with cold water from the basin. We set out by lantern light, the trail narrow and slick under the horses' hooves every turn in the dark, carrying the risk of a hidden rock or branch. By the time Morrison's cabin came into view, our horses' flanks were flecked with frozen sweat. The old man answered the door in a wool coat, eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. "Marriage at this hour," he said. I told him the truth, not all of it, but enough for him to nod. "I've seen stranger things in these hills," he said. The ceremony was short-spoken by lamplight, with only Morrison's old hound for witness. When he told Boone he could kiss his bride, the moment was steady and sure, free of any desperation that had brought us there. Morrison signed and sealed the certificate, pressing it into Boone's hand. "You'd best get home quick," he warned. "Saw riders heading your way not long ago." They weren't carrying lanterns for a friendly visit. We stepped back out into the cold, the paper tucked safe in Boone's jacket. The trail home lay black under the stars, and every turn brought us closer to whatever waited in our clearing. We rode hard back toward the cabin, the marriage paper tucked inside Boone's coat. The moon slid in and out of ragged clouds, giving the snow a restless shimmer. My hands gripped the reins tight, the cold biting through my gloves, but I kept my eyes forward. At the bend where the trail dropped into our clearing, a flicker of light broke the darkness. 6 horses stood in a half circle around the cabin, the torch flames casting shadows over the snow. Marcus Fletcher's voice carried across the cold air. "Mrs. Maddox, we know you're in there. Best come out and meet this proper." His tone had that iron edge meant to make folks obey without question. Boone nudged his horse forward, and I followed the crunch of hooves on frozen ground, drawing every eye toward us. When they saw us riding in together, faces shifted from certainty to surprise. I brought my horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "this is my husband, Boone Carter." The words seemed to land heavier than the snow on the pines. Pastor Williams's brows drew together. Impossible. No preacher here would have. Boone reached into his coat, drawing out the certificate with the territorial seal catching the firelight. Thomas Morrison did. "It's legal and it's done." For the first time, Fletcher's mask of righteousness slipped. "You can't do this. That land," he stopped short when I cut in, "belongs to me, and as my husband Boone has every right to stand on it." Samuel Reed shifted in his saddle, his horse sidestepping in the snow. Marcus, maybe Fletcher, rounded on him. "Stay out of this." Boone's voice came low but firm. "Threatening my wife on her own land will interest the territorial marshal when I ride into town with a report. Might be they'd also care to hear about the silver claim you've been keeping quiet." The torchlight caught the flicker of unease in more than one face. One by one they began to turn their horses, muttering to each other as they rode back toward the trees. Pastor Williams lingered, meeting my gaze. "I hope you know what you've done." I kept my eyes on him until he followed the others into the dark. The clearing fell silent, except for the pop of resin in the torches as they burned low. Boone swung down from his saddle, taking the reins from my hands. "It's over for tonight," he said, though both of us knew the matter wasn't buried for good. Inside, the fire had gone to embers. He stirred it back to life while I unpinned my hair and set the kettle over the flames. Neither of us spoke much, the weight of the standoff still hanging in the room. Morning came cold and bright. I stepped outside to find Boone already at work, shoveling a clear path from the cabin to the barn. The tracks from the night before were half filled with fresh snow, but the line where the horses had stood was still plain. I knew Fletcher would be turning his mind toward another way to get what he wanted. But for the moment, the ridge felt like it belonged to us again. We kept to our chores that day, repairing a length of fence the elk had pushed through, hauling water before the barrels froze solid. The sky stayed clear, the air sharp, and every so often I caught Boone watching the trail to the valley. By late afternoon, long shadows stretched across the snow, and the cold pressed in harder. Just before dusk, the sound of a single rider came from beyond the trees. I stepped to the porch as a figure came into view, coat collar turned up against the wind. The horse's breath showed in quick bursts as they closed the distance. When the rider swung down, I saw Helen Reed standing there, her gloved hand resting on the saddle horn. "I needed to come before the sun was down," she said. Her eyes moved from me to Boone, then back again. "There's talk in the valley already, and Marcus isn't done." She reached into her coat and drew out a folded paper. Not the notebook she'd left us before, but something smaller sealed in red wax. "You'll want to read this." Helen stepped inside without asking, the cold clinging to her coat and the scent of wood smoke following her. Boone shut the door behind her, the latch clicking into place. She stood for a moment near the hearth, glancing at the marriage certificate lying on the mantel, as if to confirm for herself it was real. Then she turned back to us and held out the folded paper sealed in red wax. "I found this in Samuel's desk this morning," she said. "He doesn't know it's missing. Marcus sent it to the territorial office by rider, but it must have been delayed with the snow. It's a formal request for the sheriff to come up here with a removal order." She looked straight at me. "It names you unfit to hold your own property and accuses Boone of criminal conduct. If it reaches the county seat, they'll act on it." Boone took the letter, but didn't break the seal. "Why are you giving this to us?" he asked. Helen's hands stayed folded in front of her. "Because I'm done watching them twist the truth to suit themselves. But if Samuel finds out I warned you, he'll turn on me too." She stepped closer to the fire, her voice lower now. "Marcus has already spoken with a man in town, willing to take over the claim as soon as the land is sold off. He's counting on the sheriff coming before the week is out." We sat at the table, the lamplight pooling across the worn boards, and went over what she'd said. Boone leaned forward. "If we ride to town first, we could file a counterclaim, make it harder for them to move against us." Helen shook her head. "Marcus has allies there. You'd be walking into their hands. Better to bring someone in from outside the valley, someone the townsfolk can't sway." After she left the letter still unopened on the table, Boone paced the cabin. "We can't just wait here," he said. "If Fletcher's got friends at the county seat, he'll make sure his story gets there first." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, the steam curling in the cold air between us. Then we don't wait. We make our case to someone who outranks the sheriff. That night, we planned every detail. The closest circuit judge was scheduled to be in River Bend by week's end. It meant riding 20 miles through rough country, but it also meant we could present our marriage certificate and Helen's written account before Fletcher's riders could poison the well. Boone packed the saddlebag with provisions while I wrapped the documents in oilcloth to keep them dry. We left before dawn, frost glazing the grass and the creek running dark under a skim of ice. The trail climbed steeply in places, the horse's breath showing in steady plumes. By midday, we reached the narrow pass above Miller's Gulch, where the wind cut like a blade. Snow had drifted against the rocks, forcing us to lead the horses single file along the edge. At a bend just past the gulch, Boone raised his hand for me to stop. 2 riders were ahead on the trail, their coats pulled tight, the glint of a rifle barrel catching the sun as one shifted in the saddle. We backed the horses down into the shelter of some pines. Boone's voice was low. "Fletcher's men." We waited until the sound of hooves faded, before moving again, taking a game trail that cut west around the ridge. It added an hour, but it kept us out of sight. By the time the lights of River Bend came into view, the sun was dropping, and the air smelled of chimney smoke and damp earth. The judge, a stocky man named Horace Lindell, was just leaving the small clapboard courthouse when we reached it. Boone called out, and he stopped turning to take in the sight of 2 trail-worn riders with purpose in their faces. Inside, with the door shut against the wind, we laid everything before him, the certificate, Helen's account, and the sealed letter. Judge Lindell broke the wax with a small knife, reading in silence. When he finished, he set it down and looked from me to Boone. "These are serious charges, and this," he tapped the marriage paper, "changes the standing considerably. I'll need to ride back with you to see matters for myself." It was near full dark when we left River Bend with the judge in tow. The road back was long, and the cold deepened with every mile. I kept my eyes on the beam of his lantern swinging beside us, the light marking our slow progress toward the ridge. Somewhere ahead, the cabin waited, and whatever move Marcus Fletcher had planned next. We reached the ridge well after dark, our horses moving slow from the long ride. Judge Lindell's lantern swung in the wind, the light throwing quick flashes across the snow. When the cabin came into sight, Boone drew his horse up short. The yard was empty, no sign of the men we feared might be waiting. Still, we rode in quiet ears, tuned to the smallest sound. Inside, the fire had gone to embers. I set to building it back while Boone poured coffee for the judge. Lindell stood near the table looking over the marriage certificate and Helen's statement once more. "If Fletcher's men return," he said, "I'll speak to them myself. They'll have no standing for their claims." His voice had the weight of someone used to making decisions that stuck. We settled into a watchful routine over the next 2 days. Lindell stayed close, asking questions about the land, the work we put into it, and my husband's mining claim. Boone took him along to the creek, where the ore samples had been found, the judge kneeling to turn the stones in his gloved hands. In the evenings, we ate together by lamplight, the air thick with the knowledge that Fletcher wouldn't let go easily. On the third morning, hoofbeats came from the trail. Boone stepped to the porch, rifle in hand, and saw Marcus Fletcher ride into the yard with 2 others. They pulled up short at the sight of Lindell standing beside him. Judge Fletcher said, surprise breaking through his polished tone. "Didn't know you were visiting this part of the ridge?" "I am," Lindell replied, "and I've seen and heard enough to know your accusations hold no ground. This marriage is lawful, the land is hers, and the claim remains in her name." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "We'll see what the county has to say." Lindell's gaze didn't waver. "You're welcome to take it to them, but you'll need proof. I've seen none." The men shifted in their saddles, the mood in the yard turning heavy. Fletcher gave a short nod, then wheeled his horse without another word. Snow fell from the branches overhead as they rode back down the trail. Boone let out a slow breath, lowering the rifle. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. I lay awake listening to it, knowing this wasn't the end. Fletcher had been checked, but a man with his hunger for control would find another road. Lindell agreed to stay a while longer, just to make sure the matter settles. His presence brought a measure of calm, but it also meant we were all waiting for the next move. It came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, Helen rode in, her face pale against the cold. She dismounted quickly, handing her reins to Boone. "They've called a meeting in town," she said. "Marcus means to have the claim challenged in front of the county surveyor. He's bringing a man from Carson to swear the boundary lines aren't where you think." Lindell's eyes narrowed. When Helen glanced toward the trail, 2 days' time, he'll use it to push for a reassignment of rights. Boone set his jaw. Then we'll be there with the truth in hand. The judge nodded slowly. "We'll need every scrap of record, every witness willing to speak. If they mean to fight in the open, so will we." The room went still except for the fire's low crackle. I looked at the marriage certificate on the mantel, the ink sharp in the lamplight, and thought of my husband's grave up on the ridge. Whatever fight lay ahead, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. We set out for town before first light, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Judge Lindell rode ahead, his posture square in the saddle, while Boone kept close beside me. The snow on the trail was hard-packed, each hoofbeat ringing against the frozen ground. 20 miles felt longer with the weight of what we carried: papers, witness accounts, and the knowledge that Marcus Fletcher would be waiting with his own. By the time we reached the outskirts of town, Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of wagon wheels carried down the main street. The county building stood near the square, its clapboard walls pale against the winter sky. Inside, the air was warmer, but tense men gathered in small knots, speaking in low voices. Fletcher was there, hat in hand, his eyes fixed on us as we stepped in. Beside him stood a tall, thin man in a city coat, the surveyor from Carson. The county clerk called the meeting to order, his gavel striking the desk with a sharp report. Fletcher stepped forward first, his voice smooth as he presented his claim that the boundary lines of my property were in error. The surveyor spread a set of rolled maps across the table, pointing to marks and measurements he said proved his point. When it was our turn, Judge Lindell laid out the marriage certificate and Helen's written account. He spoke with measured calm, describing the work done on the land, the clear boundaries set since my husband first staked the claim, and the ore samples taken from the creek bed well within our lines. Boone stepped up beside him, producing a hand-drawn map my husband had made years earlier, its edges worn, but the ink still clear. The room was quiet as the judge asked Helen to speak. She stepped forward, her gloved hands clasped before her, and told the clerk and gathered men what she had seen, the work, the upkeep, the truth behind the so-called improprieties. Her voice didn't shake, though. I could see the color high in her cheeks. The clerk studied both sets of papers before looking toward the surveyor. These maps don't match, and until we reconcile them, no change can be recorded. Fletcher's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. The meeting adjourned with no decision in his favor. And for the first time since this began, I saw the flicker of frustration break through his polished composure. Outside, the sun was already low, the cold pressing in again. Lindell stopped beside his horse, adjusting the cinch. "He'll try another way," he said. "But for now, you've held the ground." Boone helped me into the saddle, his hand steady on my arm. As we rode out of town, I glanced back once to see Fletcher watching from the boardwalk, his coat collar turned up against the wind. The trail home was quiet, but for the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Snow began to fall fine at first, then heavier as we neared the ridge. I could see the lamps glowing in our cabin windows when we heard the faint sound of a single rider behind us. The figure kept their distance, never closing the gap, shadowed against the white until we reached our clearing. We dismounted quickly, getting the horses inside before the snow closed in. Lindell lingered near the door, his gaze drifting toward the trail. "We'll keep watch tonight," he said, voice low. Boone nodded, setting the rifle within reach. Whatever Fletcher's next move would be, it was coming. That night, the snow kept falling, muffling every sound beyond the windows. Boone and Judge Lindell took turns keeping watch, the rifle resting across their knees. I stayed near the fire, mending by lamplight, though my eyes strayed often to the door. The lone rider we'd heard earlier never came closer, but we all knew Fletcher wasn't finished. Morning brought a brittle cold and a pale sun. Just after we sat down to coffee, hoofbeats came again, this time fast, urgent. Helen Reed burst into the yard, her horse lathered from the ride. She swung down, breath clouding in the air. "It's over," she said. "Fletcher's been called to account in Carson. Word reached the county that he falsified records on 2 other land claims. He won't be coming back here." Lindell stepped outside to speak with her while Boone and I stood in the doorway. The tension that had wound tight for weeks began to ease like a rope slowly uncoiling. When the judge returned, he gave a short nod. "Your land is secure. The claim remains in your name, and if anyone tries to challenge it again, they'll find the law on your side." The days that followed felt different. The air seemed lighter on the ridge, the work less burdened by the thought of someone trying to take what we had built. Helen came by once more to leave the thicker notebook she had kept, pressing it into my hands without a word. I set it on the mantel, knowing it held the proof of what we'd fought for, not just the land, but our right to live as we chose. Spring came early that year. Boone and I planted a larger garden, repaired the barn roof, and marked out a new paddock for stock we planned to buy. Judge Lindell rode on to his next circuit, leaving with a firm handshake and a promise to return if we ever needed him. In the evenings, Boone and I would sit on the porch, the light fading over the peaks, the mule cropping grass nearby. It's been years since then. The silver my husband once suspected lay in the hills did indeed show itself enough to make the work easier and the winters more comfortable. But that's not the treasure I think of when I walk this land. What we have here was won by standing our ground, by holding fast to what was right, when it would have been easier to turn away. Some folks will tell you the frontier is about finding riches or carving out a piece of wilderness for yourself. For me, it's been about finding the people who'll stand beside you when the wind turns cold. That's worth more than silver ever could be. If you've ever had to fight for your place in the world and won, I'd like to hear your story.